No, thank you very much. So Eric, thank you for joining me today. Obviously, former colleagues, and we're going to have an interesting discussion on inclusion. So Eric Collins, serial entrepreneur, CEO of ImpactX, and one of the things that I wanted to delve into today was the fact that if you look at the world as we live in today, some of the most valuable companies have been venture-backed, right? So you've got your Microsofts, your Amazons, and so on. However, if you look at that, despite the fact that venture funding is growing exponentially, the funding that's going to women and so on has been declining. Less than 1.5% went to women last year. When it comes to black founders, that number's even more dire. So what's your thought on DEI within the venture landscape?
Wow. So thank you for having me and inviting me to do this with you, Yvonne. I think many people don't realize that you are one of the most successful young VCs out there who's actually backed 3 unicorns, all in the fintech space on a variety of continents. So I think that is itself, fantastic. And I'm sure that when many people look, they say, she looks like a black woman from the UK who's done that, and that's not exactly who we demographically are biased to believing will get those sorts of results, because the companies that you named are not started by people who sort of look and sound like you. So I'm fascinated when I think about sort of what it is that this panel's about, and it's about really sort of inclusion starts with the first check, that who writes the check makes a determination of who gets funded, and then has the cascading effects throughout the organization. So my thought is that I am so passionate these days about making sure that those checks are in the hands from asset allocators of the right kind of general partner. And that there are just too many organizations that, as I look across, in fact, ImpactX started because we think that there's a great capital inefficiency. And, we love people of color. I always default to the idea that if we were trying to find someone who's extremely competent, it's probably going to be a black woman somewhere who's the most competent in whatever it is that I'm looking for. So that's just me as my demographic bias. But when you then try and put that into an investment strategy and say that who is going to actually deliver for you alpha on a consistent basis, and where you're going to find that differentiated deal flow that other people aren't looking at. That's how we came to underrepresented in Europe and the UK, and the numbers that you talked about are exactly correct. That if you look at so I seem to be able to see it, our ROI seems to show that it makes sense, but other people around me, my peers and colleagues, don't necessarily seem to have the same demographic bias that I do, and therefore, in my opinion, are missing a trick. So thank goodness they're missing a trick, and we're able to pick up on that trick.
And that's where the opportunity lies, right?
Absolutely.
With underrepresented entrepreneurs. I think there was actually a report released 2 weeks ago that suggested that oftentimes it's the emerging managers that identify the best founders and the underdogs. So that was a really interesting report that was released.
And when you find, I think that's very consistent, that when you look, in fact, in terms of which emerging managers are actually gaining traction, those who are particularly looking at impact, those emerging managers are much more diverse than are the traditional. So if you're looking at organizations that are raising huge funds for impact, especially environmental impact, they're not. But the number of organizations that are raising, PitchBook did a study of this and recently published this. And so I'm very much a believer. So hopefully the world is coming around to my view of the world.
And you spoke about the impact of the funders having a cascading effect, right?
Yeah.
And I agree with you from that perspective. We've seen in the US the Fearless Fund, where they were actually taken to court saying that they were being discriminatory by having a program focused on black women.
Correct.
And the discourse amongst LPs is almost changing. What trends are you seeing in some of your fundraising conversations? Are you seeing a shift away from DEI, or are you seeing LPs moving more towards it?
It is it's a very good question, Yvonne, and very complicated, because what we are seeing is that there is a love of the idea that we should actually be investing in a differentiated fashion. When it comes down to what does differentiated look like, many of the LPs that we talk to, the ones that aren't so bold, will say, well, we can't really sort of preference one group over another, although we know that based on, if you're just looking at pure science and math, it's statistically impossible that every good idea that has happened in the last however many years venture has been a category, has been driven by a group of men out of out of Silicon Valley. It's impossible that there were no good ideas anyplace else. We do know that money existed there. We do know an ecosystem existed there. We do know that there's some great things about being in the shadow of Stanford, but that there are other places where there are good ideas, other populations. So what we focus on is, I try not to focus on the negative, that indeed, the Supreme Court of the United States has said that the protected class of black is not sufficient, and historical wrongs that involve black people are not sufficient to positively discriminate, as we talk about in this country, to positively discriminate in terms of actions, and that indeed we need to do something which is a little more race blind. What I think the way that we have actually dealt with that, and what we're seeing in the LP market, is that there are organizations that believe that the future looks a bit more diverse, with people in positions of power and decision making, and that especially when we're talking to pension funds and others, the people whose money is being invested are people of color, women and others. So that what we're doing is, if we continue not to look at that, is we are actually not following the values of our membership. So we work with those sorts of organizations.
Reframing the discussion as opposed to speaking about the issues that we're currently facing.
Absolutely.
Speaking more to the opportunities.
Always the opportunity.
Yeah.
I mean, in my opinion, differentiated deal flow is the key to being an effective VC. And so how better to do that than look places where others aren't? And that doesn't change just because the American Supreme Court has a bit of a hiccup.
Right. And I guess, if we look at the D&I movement, we had George Floyd, where obviously we had the Black Square, all these companies were making commitments to invest in diversity programs and so on. And it's almost like the opposite's happening now, right? To some extent with some of these companies, particularly in the US, where we've had this fearless fund situation. What do you see as the trajectory here in the UK specifically, as opposed to the US? Because I think that oftentimes we default to the US when we're having these sort of conversations, but I'd love to hear how you see things.
If I could just sit in the minds of people, Yvonne, and read those minds, I'd be so much of a better fundraiser and so much of a better venture capitalist. What I do believe is that we are seeing, so ImpactX had a first fund, and that first fund we closed back in 2019. We deployed capital, and we have been harvesting ever since. The next fund that we raised, and that was all individuals from the United States, the UK, and then France. The second fund that we raised, which was announced, the story was broken by Reuters a few weeks ago. This one is...
Congratulations.
Thank you very much, thank you. And it's your assistance in our track record that helped that to happen, so thank you. But the organizations behind that are institutional investors, right? So we have Bank of America. The first balance sheet investment that they did in Europe or the UK was with us.
Right.
We have the Visa Foundation. So the Visa Foundation is a foundation where we are not getting a grant. We are actually given an allocation from their endowment. The Guys in St. Thomas's Foundation, so jump across the ocean. Now we're at the Guys in St. Thomas's Health Foundation here. We have an endowment allocation from them also. Those organizations need that money back in order to fulfill their needs. And they've said that the organization that they want to work with, one of the organizations, they obviously work with many organizations, but one of them is ImpactX. It's because of our performance. It's not because we have, and the performance is because we have decided that indeed we can get this differentiated deal flow. Now, if I look at those organizations, and this has happened in the last 12 months, this did not happen in the go-go era of black fund managers in 2020 when George Floyd was murdered before our eyes and we're sitting watching while we were all at home with COVID. But this is later. And in that later sort of world, and in this transitioned and evolved world, we're finding the organizations say we need to double down in terms of what's happening. And then they also, I think, see that the impacts that we're talking about are impacts which are also driving other agendas. So the ESG is something that we don't really talk about because it's just in our DNA. But we are finding that more and more of our portfolio companies are actually sort of having positive impacts in E. So Inoa with their net zero company, Stetisol in Sweden with its approach to helping in terms of transportation and fleet management for ships. I think that I think that the organizations that are working with us are saying that 1+1. So that diverse set of thinking and that diverse portfolio that is created and focused on a variety of impact metrics, they really are delivering for us in a variety of ways. Again, I'm not in their minds, but that's what I think they should think.
Cool. And I guess thinking about, the UK and even further afield, when you look at UK fintech, around 30% of the workforce is women, right? Yeah. And we all know the data that's come out that said, women and, having women in team, having diverse teams makes for better business. How does ImpactX think about that when you're working with your teams? oftentimes there's resistance to having diversity. How have you gone about implementing that with the companies that you work with?
So can I make a very small confession in this small group?
Yeah.
So we have had a diversity crisis recently at ImpactX. Our diversity crisis is, we have had, if you look at you should look at our website, www.impactxcapital.com. It looks very homogenous. So it's all black. We've hired our first white man. And it has been, so most of you would have a different issue, right? So we're having a diversity crisis of the white man who's now joined our organization, who has a different set of experiences, has a different sort of language, has a different sort of a positioning in the world than the rest of us actually do, and has come out of venture space, has a fantastic background as you'd expect. And sort of how do we integrate him? So I sort of get the idea that sometimes this is a bit more challenging, but this is challenging in the reverse for us.
Right.
And so for us, how do we actually get the most out of it? What you said, the diversity of thought, the diversity of experience, the diversity of being is actually something which we think will actually drive even better results for us. So we're going to lean into diversity. All right?
Cool. Some parting words of wisdom for the audience?
Some parting words of wisdom, that if you really want to bet on sort of getting good results, I say that the group which is underrepresented and underappreciated from the perspective of ROI are black women. And that is what that's what we're looking at across Europe, and we're seeing so many fantastic, innovative, resilient business models and some tenacious entrepreneurs. So if you're looking for a deal flow that's differentiated and going to give you that alpha that we all need, that's what I'm looking for.
Cool. You know where to go. Thank you.
Thank you.